The moment you reach for help and nothing answers is not the beginning of failure. It is the confirmation that failure has already occurred. The phone still has power, the network icon may still appear, the emergency number still exists, but the response you expect, the system that arrives, stabilizes, and restores order, has already been overwhelmed long before you realize it. The danger is not that help stops. It is that it stops invisibly, gradually, and then all at once, leaving you operating under the false assumption that support is still available when it no longer is. From an analytical standpoint, emergency response systems are designed around capacity thresholds, not infinite demand. Every layer, dispatch centers, communication networks, field responders, medical infrastructure, operates with a maximum load it can handle under peak conditions. These systems are highly efficient within their design limits, but they are not built for simultaneous, large-scale demand spikes. When a critical event occurs, the number of incidents rises sharply, often exceeding the system's capacity within minutes. At that point, the system does not simply slow down. It begins to triage, prioritize, and eventually drop lower priority responses altogether. The common misunderstanding is that emergency services fail only under extreme, catastrophic conditions. People assume that unless the entire system collapses, help will still be available, even if delayed. This belief is reinforced by everyday experience, where services respond reliably and quickly. But this reliability exists because demand is normally distributed across time and geography. When that distribution collapses, when many incidents occur at once in a concentrated area, the system cannot scale to meet the surge. It shifts from a model of universal response to selective response, where only the most critical cases receive attention. The hidden science behind this lies in queue saturation and service prioritization. Emergency systems operate using triage protocols that categorize incidents based on severity and survivability. As demand increases, response times lengthen, and lower priority calls are delayed or canceled entirely. This is not a failure of the system's design. It is the system functioning as intended under overload conditions. The goal shifts from helping everyone to maximizing overall survival outcomes with limited resources. This means that many individuals who would normally receive assistance are effectively excluded from the response pool. Evidence from large-scale emergencies demonstrates how rapidly this transition occurs. In major disasters, emergency call volumes can increase by several 100% within minutes. Dispatch centers become saturated, leading to delayed call handling or complete inability to connect. Field units once deployed are tied up for extended periods, reducing their availability for new incidents. Hospitals, receiving a surge of patients, begin to operate beyond capacity, implementing their own triage systems that prioritize critical cases while deferring others. The result is a cascading reduction in effective response, where each layer of the system reinforces the limitations of the others. The survival implication is immediate and often misunderstood. The availability of help is not binary, but conditional and time-dependent. There is a narrow window during which emergency services can still respond effectively before demand exceeds capacity. Once that window closes, the system's behavior changes fundamentally. Response times become unpredictable, coverage becomes uneven, and reliance on external assistance becomes increasingly risky. As conditions escalate, the degradation of response systems follows a predictable pattern. Communication is the first layer to show strain. Increased call volume leads to longer wait times, dropped connections, and reduced clarity of information. This is followed by dispatch saturation, where operators are forced to prioritize calls, leaving some unaddressed. Field response is next, as units are dispatched to high-priority incidents and become unavailable for others. Finally, support infrastructure, such as hospitals and supply systems, becomes overloaded, limiting the effectiveness of even those responses that do occur. The misunderstanding at this stage is that persistence will overcome delay. People believe that if they keep trying, calling repeatedly, waiting longer, seeking alternative contact methods, they will eventually receive help. This assumption fails because it treats delay as a temporary backlog rather than a systemic limitation. When the system is saturated, additional attempts do not increase the likelihood of response. They contribute to the overload, further reducing overall efficiency. The deeper scientific layer involves system throughput and bottleneck theory. In any complex system, overall performance is constrained by its slowest component. In emergency response, this bottleneck can shift depending on conditions, communication networks, dispatch capacity, field availability, or medical infrastructure. As demand increases, each component approaches its limit, and once one becomes saturated, it restricts the entire system's output. Efforts to increase throughput in one area are ineffective if another bottleneck remains unresolved. This interdependence ensures that once saturation begins, recovery within the active event becomes extremely difficult. Documented scenarios highlight how quickly help becomes inaccessible. In large-scale incidents, response times that are normally measured in minutes can extend to hours or longer. Some calls are never answered, not due to negligence, but because the system lacks the capacity to process them. In extreme cases, individuals are advised through automated systems to seek alternative assistance or to self-manage situations that would normally require professional intervention. This represents a shift from centralized response to distributed responsibility, where individuals must rely on their own resources and decision-making. For survival planning, this means that the assumption of external support must be time-limited. There is a point beyond which waiting for help is not just ineffective, but dangerous. Recognizing this point requires attention to early indicators of system strain, delayed responses, communication issues, visible overextension of services. Acting before these indicators escalate preserves the option of external assistance. Acting after they are widespread means operating without it. As escalation continues, the absence of reliable help begins to influence behavior. Individuals adjust their actions based on the expectation that assistance will not arrive. This can lead to both adaptive and maladaptive responses, self-reliance in some cases, panic or risky behavior in others. The collective effect is a further increase in system stress, as more incidents are generated by attempts to compensate for the lack of support. The transition point is subtle but critical. It is the moment when the probability of receiving timely help drops below the threshold where waiting is a viable strategy. This threshold is not publicly defined, and it varies depending on the nature of the event and the capacity of the system. However, it can be inferred from the convergence of delays, communication breakdowns, and visible strain on response units. Once crossed, the system is no longer a reliable safety net. Understanding this transition is essential because it marks the shift from dependence to autonomy. Before it, external systems can still augment your survival. After it, they cannot be counted on, and decisions must be made with the assumption that no help is coming in time. And as that realization sets in, the next layer of complexity emerges. Not just how fast help stops, but how quickly the absence of help reshapes the entire environment around you. Once the reality settles and that help is no longer guaranteed, the environment itself begins to transform in ways that amplify the stakes. Roads, once navigable under moderate congestion, start to clog unpredictably as individuals react to delayed or non-existent responses, creating secondary hazards that few anticipate. Medical emergencies that would have been promptly addressed now escalate, and minor injuries can become life-threatening due to lack of intervention. Infrastructure continues to function, but only partially. Traffic signals flicker inconsistently, water distribution slows, and public services operate under extreme rationing. The danger is no longer abstract. It manifests in every interaction, every choice, and every delayed or blocked pathway. Analytically, this shift represents a systemic transition from managed response to localized improvisation. Emergency services, previously centralized and coordinated, fragment under strain. Dispatch prioritization becomes narrower, field units are stretched beyond sustainable coverage, and the flow of actionable information deteriorates. The misunderstanding many individuals harbor is that partial functionality implies safety, that some service availability is sufficient to maintain normalcy. In truth, partial functionality is deceptive. It masks the underlying fragility and creates the illusion of resilience while the system teeters on collapse. The hidden science underpinning this transition lies in network interdependencies and cascading failures. Communication, transportation, medical response, and supply networks are tightly coupled. When one fails, it propagates stress across others. For instance, delayed ambulance deployment can congest hospital intake, which then limits emergency capacity for new arrivals. Traffic bottlenecks impede supply trucks, slowing fuel and food deliveries, which in turn affects local response readiness. Each failure magnifies the next, accelerating the overall degradation of support structures. Evidence from historical disasters supports this model. In major earthquakes, hurricanes, and urban blackouts, initial minor disruptions, phone outages, traffic delays, partial power loss, rapidly cascade into systemic crises. In every case, early indicators were present, but their significance was misinterpreted. Individuals who recognized subtle early signs and acted preemptively maintained access to critical resources, while those waiting for confirmation found themselves trapped in systems that could no longer respond. The survival implications are profound. Waiting for external help beyond the early warning signals is not just risky, it is a strategic error. As the system reaches saturation, the ability to rely on structured support disappears incrementally and then suddenly. Self-sufficiency becomes the primary determinant of survival, and preparation, including prepositioned resources, alternative routes, and contingency plans, shifts from optional to essential. Every delay reduces options and magnifies exposure to hazards that were previously mitigated by functioning response systems. As escalation intensifies, behavioral dynamics compound the crisis. Crowds converge on limited accessible resources, competition increases, and the risk of conflict rises. Those who fail to anticipate the diminishing response capacity are forced into reactive decisions, often in unsafe or suboptimal conditions. Conversely, individuals who act early maintain strategic flexibility, exploiting residual system functionality before it is irretrievably lost. Timing, foresight, and rapid adaptation become the most critical survival tools. The transition to full autonomy occurs progressively yet relentlessly. Systems no longer operate to absorb shocks, they merely exist as fragile remnants. Communication becomes intermittent, transportation corridors clog unpredictably, and medical and logistical support reach critical overload. Recognition of this stage is essential. It is the boundary beyond which reliance on external systems transforms from hopeful to dangerous. Crossing it without adequate self-preparedness significantly increases risk of injury, resource loss, or worse. Understanding this boundary also informs proactive strategy. By monitoring indicators such as response delays, intermittent service availability, and visible stress on infrastructure,